Most South Koreans don't know who Choi Hong-hi is, and they don't know that Taekwondo, the name, is only 70 years old. They think that Taekwondo is 2,000 years old, which is a myth invented by Park Chung-hee regime. Taekwondo comes from karate. It was built on this karate foundation, and then it slowly evolved into a new martial art with very much Korean characteristics. This brings us to another extremely important principle in Korean culture, which is gokseonmi, the beauty of a curved line. In one part, it derives from Korean geography and nature. So Korean mountains are these kind of curvy, sloping mountains in the distance. Yeah. Now, in Korean dance, you see all the movements are movements that they would say they draw circles. So the arm comes up in a curved, a very graceful, curved way. It doesn't straight up or straight down. There should be a curved movement in the way that it's performed. Taoism kind of became the cosmology for East Asia. So all of East Asia for centuries understood reality as this balance of opposites that's constantly in transition. I'm Sanko Lewis. I'm from South Africa, and I've been living in Korea now for 15 some years. Yeah, people come to Korea now for K-pop.
Yeah,
I came because of Taekwondo. Taekwondo is the first Korean wave. Most people think of K-pop and the dramas, Korean dramas, as Korean wave. But actually, long before, it was Taekwondo and Hapkido in the 60s that went around the world and introduced the world to Korea. The martial arts.
That's quite cool. And you said that you learned, they're named parts, I'm getting it wrong, parts of Taekwondo are named after historical figures or events or culture or something. What was that part of it?
The till, which we, in ITF we call it till, in Kuki Taekwondo, which is Olympic style Taekwondo, they are called pumse. So these are the choreographed movements that you have to learn to progress through the bouts. And in ITF Taekwondo, these till are named after prominent figures. The first till is called Chonji till, Chonji like heaven and earth, which kind of lays the foundation for Korean cosmology. And then it's Dangun till, of course, the mythical founder of Korea, and so on, like Dosan till, Andosan, the famous scholar and activist, freedom activist, educator, Wonhyo till, the Buddhist monk, Twege till, Hwarang till, Chungmu, who Ishunshin, Gebek till, he was a general, Sam-il, referring to the Independence Day,
March 1st,
and so on. So there's 24 of these till. The final till is called Tongil till, hoping for reunification with North and South Korea. So as you progress through these things, you learn a lot about Korean history, Korean philosophy, and so on. Something like Chonji is the introduction to Korean cosmology, the idea of heaven and earth combined. These two characters, when you put them together as Chonji, it is not simply heaven and earth, it's creation. So it's the moment of creation, which therefore is the foundational form that you learn when you're a white belt, and so on. Yeah.
That's brilliant that it starts with Chonji and ends with Tongil. I had no idea about any of this. Can you say, this might be a weird question, say something about heaven in the Korean context, like Chon, because we translate it as heaven, and maybe in Chinese like Tian, like Tiananmen Square. But if we think of that through a Western context, we might get it wrong. Do we get it wrong? What does Chon in Chonji mean?
Yeah, so from a Western concept, heaven and earth are simply spatial relations. But in East Asia, Chonji is definitely more than that, and especially in Korea. Chon, and in Chinese as well, Tian, has the connotation of the law or principles of creation. So sometimes it's anthropomorphized as God. So you can think of Tian or heaven as God, or the principles of God, or the principles that govern creation, and earth then being our earthly realm. And in Korea, you see it in the taegukgi, in the flag. The symbol in the middle is the taegukdo. Taeguk referring to In Chinese, it's Tai Chi, which is the grand ultimate. So the ultimate reality is this opposition of heaven or the ethereal and Qi, earth, the material.
Isn't Tai Chi also
a martial art?
Is the same Tai Chi?
Yes, same word, Tai Chi and Chuan. In Korean, we would say Guan. So in Taekwondo, that's Guan in the middle is the same thing that you have in Tai Chi Chuan. It's the same character, Chinese character, which means fist or something like fist. It's like a fist in action, like boxing or something like that.
You said something about Taekwondo being the first Hallyu. Do you know anything about sort of the 60s and 70s? Was that it going to the West? Was that in the United States? Were there certain practitioners? How was it received? Do you know anything about the history of those early days? Or
yes, so it was under the influence of a particular figure, Choi Hong-hi. He was a South Korean general, and he is the person that coined the name Taekwondo.
Oh, wow.
He made the name.
So it's quite new then, the name Taekwondo?
Yeah, 1955. So Taekwondo itself is pretty young. And Choi Hong-hi, his first instructors under him were first sent out basically on diplomatic government missions to different countries, Malaysia, Vietnam, and so on, Hong Kong later, officially as a kind of a intercultural or military exchange program where these people would go there and teach this martial art to the local communities. So it started in Asia and then later went to Europe and to America. And it was very well received, which is the reason Taekwondo could become an Olympic sport later. Because of this first generation of instructors kind of laying the foundation, starting schools around the world, and later on what is now known as WT, World Taekwondo, was able to kind of co-opt that early foundation and claim, we are already all around the world, so we can become an Olympic sport. But what these original Taekwondo people were doing, the style of Taekwondo that they were teaching is quite different from Olympic Taekwondo as we know it now.
What was the original Taekwondo? What was the differences?
So originally, Taekwondo developed in the Korean military. So the goal was never for it to be a sport at that time. It was considered a combat system and a martial art in the sense of a system for self-development and growth, which is quite different from sports Taekwondo, where the focus is sport. And ITF Taekwondo, which is the style of Taekwondo that I do, is still connected to that kind of original purpose, more focused on self-defense rather than sports, although the sport aspect competitions there is competition, but the emphasis is different. So the emphasis is more on self-defense and on what we call moral culture. So teaching ethical values based on East Asian philosophical traditions.
Is there any relation to North Korea? Does North Korea accept this 1955 South Korean Taekwondo, or how does that work? Because the goal is Tongil, that's the last stage. How do they view Taekwondo?
So Taekwondo was introduced, let's begin by saying Taekwondo started in South Korea, as far south as Jeju-do Islands, because this General Choi Hong-hi, when he created his first Taekwondo school, it was on Jeju-do.
What do you call a Taekwondo? It's not a dojo, is it? That's Japanese. What do you call a Taekwondo school?
Dojang.
Okay, I was close.
Yeah. The Odogwan, which was this first school that Choi Hong-hi created, was on Jeju Island. In any case, later on, Choi Hong-hi had a falling out, let's call it a falling out, with Pak Chung-hee, and he had to flee for his life. So he fled to Canada, and he took with him many of the instructors. So by that time, the ITF Taekwondo was already an international organization. ITF stands for International Taekwondo Federation, with Choi Hong-hi as the president of this organization.
What was the falling out with Park about, do you know?
Yes, so before Park became president, there was a tribunal that accused him of being a Japanese collaborator. And Choi Hong-hi was on this tribunal. Okay, so later when Park became president, this military general, Choi Hong-hi, and him were not on good terms, obviously. And Choi Hong-hi opposed Park later on. Although, I must say, at the beginning of the coup, he was supportive of the coup, but he thought somebody else would be the leader after the coup. This Choi Hong-hi thought somebody else would be the leader, but then it turned out that this person that he was accusing of being a Japanese collaborator was the leader after the coup. Anyway, so he fled to Canada, and he eventually became a Canadian citizen in good standing, in such a good standing that Canada nominated him for a Nobel Prize.
Wow.
Yeah. But in the 1980s, Choi Hong-hi went to North Korea and introduced Taekwondo to North Korea. And this became quite a controversial thing. And people in the South, of course, hated him for it. And he was never able to return to South Korea. In fact, before he died of cancer. He requested the South Korean government to be buried in South Korea, and they didn't allow him. Now, remember, this is the person that basically invented Taekwondo, the national sport. But yeah, they didn't allow him.
When did he die? So what government was it, roughly?
2001, if I remember correctly.
Just probably No Mufyan. No, that would be Kim Dae-jung time, I guess.
I can't remember. I hope my dates is correct. I think it's 2001.
Yeah.
So he asked North Korea if he could be buried in North Korea, because he wanted to be buried in Korean soil, and they allowed him to be buried there. Yeah, so
that's an ending to that story I never would have imagined.
Yeah, that's a fascinating story, but it's part of his wish for Tongil. So he created these forms, and he named all the forms, including the final form, Tongil, which he saw as his ultimate hope and legacy. He hopes that Taekwondo could be a bridge that connects North and South Korea. And there's been several instances where Taekwondo had been such a bridge. For instance, with the Pyeongchang Olympics, the Winter Olympics, North and South Korean Taekwondo players were together on stage performing, giving a demonstration during the opening ceremony. So there has been several of these moments where there's been this intercultural exchange with the North Korean Taekwondo team and the South Korean Taekwondo team.
Is there North Korean Taekwondo the same as South Korean? Is there any difference? Have you done Taekwondo with a North Korean?
So what North Korea do is ITF Taekwondo.
Which is the original 55 one here.
And South Korea mostly do WT Taekwondo. Like 99% of all the dojang that you go to in South Korea would be Olympic-style Taekwondo.
So let me just get this straight. The ITF was started and founded here in South Korea, and they do that in North Korea, but the ones that most South Koreans do now is the
sport version.
The sport version.
Yeah.
Why did they change?
Well, partly because they didn't want to do the Choi Hong-hi version, and also because from the very start, Choi Hong-hi was a controversial figure, and he created a form of Taekwondo based on karate, and the other people who taught karate in South Korea at the time, they also developed their form of Taekwondo. Well, not Taekwondo, Korean karate. But Choi Hong-hi insisted that they use the Taekwondo name. And he, in his authority as a military general, kind of persuaded them, coerced them to adopt his name. And they reluctantly did so, but they did accept the name Taekwondo. So from the very start, there were these two streams. One that was military-based and the other one that was kind of civilian-based. And the civilian-based one moved into a sport direction very early on, whereas ITF Taekwondo retained the self-defense focus much longer before adopting the sport as well. So both of them have self-defense and sport and so on, but it's an emphasis difference, with WT being much more sport-focused, and especially after becoming an Olympic sport, that's the primary focus. And ITF being more the martial art focused.
I see figures online like Stephen Capener.
Yes.
And John Frankel. and sometimes Andrew Salmon, and they'll lambast videos of Olympic Taekwondo saying this is not Taekwondo. They seem very angry about what is at the Olympics.
Yes. So those figures are traditionally WT practitioners. So it's not like they are, like in my case, an ITF practitioner looking at the sport and complaining, oh, it's too much of a sport rather than a martial art in a traditional sense. For them, it's a sport that has lost its way, mostly because of rule changes. So the sport Taekwondo was a full contact sport, and to score a point you really had to you had to hit your opponent with such force that it creates some type of shock, and for this point to be scored, the person really had to move back, or the judges had to decide, okay, this was really a trembling shock, powerful attack. Otherwise the point wouldn't be scored.
But if the person just stood there and took it, it wouldn't be scored. There's
It's
no
not
tremble.
scored.
Okay, okay.
So basically, that's one of the reasons why Olympic sport Taekwondo is so much focused on kicks rather than punches. It's really difficult to hit somebody with a punch and make them move backwards, because that was one of the ways that they could determine if it's really a powerful attack or not. So with a kick, you can kick somebody and they can fall over. But with a punch to the body, that's unlikely. In any case, the rule changes because of the electronic scoring system completely changed the game. So the electronic scoring system is a system in which the body armor has a circuit that is completed when the opponent hits your body armor with the attacking tool, a glove or a boot that also has electric charge. Or I'm not sure how it works exactly, but in any case, if you hit the target, the circuit is completed and the point is scored, which means you don't need that trembling shock anymore. So that has completely changed the game from a full contact sport, including lots of knockouts, to basically tag with the feet. So now you just need to touch the opponent appropriately and it will score a point.
It's like touch rugby or something.
Well, I think touch rugby is even more of a contact sport than what Taekwondo has become. So that's one of the reasons. There are several other reasons. Another reason is now, previously, to score a point, the judges had to judge whether the technique was a proper technique. Like, was it really a worthy martial arts technique? But now you can touch the opponent's body armor, and with any method. It's like the way you touch doesn't need to follow a particular powerful trajectory or whatever. So the technique is gone. Like sometimes some of the techniques that score points it won't ever work as a martial art technique. Like if you were to hit somebody on the streets for self-defense, it's a useless technique, but it scores points. So that's one of the other things. It doesn't look like Taekwondo anymore because some of the movements are not actual technical martial arts movements anymore. It's simply tag, touching the opponent's scoring area.
It's not as fun to watch. I probably watch it wrong, but I see two people sort of bouncing on their heels, and then all of a sudden they'll do some spins and it's finished.
Yeah, I'm reluctant to critique it because it's not what I do.
Yeah.
And people would say, "Who are you to judge it? You don't know. You don't understand it." Because I do a different system. In ITF Taekwondo, sparring is more like kickboxing. Much more fun to watch.
As a spectator sport, sort of, I don't know boxing or UFC, but I can watch it sometimes and think, well, yeah, go on, hit him, go on. And it's enjoyable.
Whereas what WT has become is this kind of it's quite a boring game, to be honest. Yeah. And it has lost a lot of the dynamism that it used to have, because much of the previous game was about really powerful kicks and the ability to dodge those kicks and simultaneously counterattack. And it creates for very dynamic exchanges between opponents. But what you have now is not that. You have, as you say, people bouncing and waiting it out and trying to score a point. In the past, you didn't always worry so much about getting hit, because if you can dodge it, the power of that kick will not score. But now people are too nervous to move because even a weak kick can score. Yeah, so it's changed the game a lot, and not for the better.
Let's take a step back, maybe, Sanko, and talk about martial arts in general. Because Taekwondo is not karate, is not judo. I don't know. Like, you know, I grew up with boxing and things like this, and it all seems very exotic and different to me. Can you maybe say something about like what martial arts is, what they have in common, or what makes Taekwondo different? Is it fundamentally different from boxing in certain ways, or what's this Eastern martial arts?
Okay, firstly, let's just define martial arts.
Yeah, please. I don't know what that means either. I just used it.
So I'm going to define it etymologically.
Okay.
So martial comes from Mars, the god of war, and art is not something aesthetic. It comes from Old French, ars, which we still have the English word artisan. So an artisan is not an artist. An artisan is somebody that's really skilled in something. So basically it's the skill of warfare. So that's what martial arts mean. So if you use that definition, which is the definition I use, it's any systematized fighting. So using that definition, boxing, Western boxing, would also be a martial art. So under this umbrella term of martial arts, you would have things like combat sports, which is Western boxing. In my opinion, WT Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo is mostly a combat sport now. And then you would have other things. You would have self-defense systems or combative systems that you would use in the military, something like Krav Maga in the Israeli military. Or you would have traditional martial arts. And traditional martial arts are martial arts that kind of connect to the local culture. Many of the movements are also... If you look at the traditional martial art and you look at the traditional dance of that culture, you would often find connections. And traditional martial arts also tend to have a focus on a moral enarmament, a moral growth, which you won't find in the sport. So in UFC, that type of MMA fighting, there's no focus on becoming a better person. Focus is on becoming a better fighter. Now, for that, you need discipline and so on. So you can grow in some virtues like discipline, for instance, and courage and whatever. But generally speaking, that is a secondary goal. Whereas with a traditional martial art, that is often one of the primary goals. Apart from learning how to fight or doing self-defense, there's also this ethical, maybe, what we in Taekwondo call moral culture. This idea of growing morally. And
how does that work when you're punching people?
Yeah, good question. Well, firstly, so there's two parts to this answer. One part is that the martial art becomes a vehicle or a place in which you can teach other things. Okay. So think of Shaolin Kung Fu. So Shaolin martial arts is done at the Shaolin Temple, and many of the acolytes that want to learn the martial arts go there, but they also learn Buddhist philosophy. So it's kind of used as a means to which to introduce them to Buddhism. So that's one way. So the martial arts often have a similar way of introducing people to philosophy and moral ideas. And for instance, if you go to any traditional Taekwondo school, in every class you would likely recite some moral virtues like courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, indomitable spirit. That's usually the 5 that would be recited.
In Korean or?
Both, Korean and English. It depends on the
How does
instructor.
it sound? Do you know how it sounds? They go,
well, no, usually they just recite it at the beginning of class or after
Okay,
class. Yeah,
okay.
It's not necessarily with a punch or anything.
Okay.
It's just, okay, you've stepped into the dojang, the space of the do, and in this space we are now consecrating it to ethical values, and these are the ethical values. So there's kind of this ritualistic experience that you have in a traditional martial art, which you don't have in a boxing gym. You go into the boxing gym, you put on your gloves, you do some jump ropes to warm up, and you start punching.
I always imagine there'd be sort of a, a mantra on the wall from the trainer, like, you know, respect your opponent, fear is not welcome, or something.
I'm not sure about respect your opponent, more something like what move like a butterfly, sting like a bee, some motivational quote.
Everyone has a motivation until they get punched in the mouth.
Something like pain is fun or whatever. So it doesn't have to be a moral teaching, but you do see in boxing gyms some of those type of motivational quotes. Whereas in a traditional martial arts, it would be quite explicitly moral teachings, trying to instill philosophical ideas or moral ideas in the students. And if the instructor is a good instructor, that would be part of their mission. Is I am not only building strong bodies, but I want to build healthy minds and moral or virtuous minds. That is what a good sabomnim is. Sabom is the Korean word for instructor.
Okay.
In ITF Taekwondo, we have some other titles as well, which like the next level is Sahyun, which is virtuous instructor. Nice. And then Sasong, which is a sage-like instructor, very wise and so on. So that's part of the mission of a good instructor in a traditional martial art would be to teach morality through the medium of martial arts. Now, your other question is, how can punching somebody in the face lead to morals? Or one answer is it teaches you courage, and all virtues require courage. To have integrity, you have to have the courage to stand for the principles you believe in, for instance. Benevolence. To be a benevolent person, you have to have the courage to bestow benevolence on somebody when everybody else wouldn't do that or would look down on you. Why are you loving your enemy? Well, you have to have the courage to do that. So that's one thing. A martial art, unlike most other body disciplines, forces you to confront fear. I mean, you can get all the physical benefits and maybe more from dancing than you can get from martial arts. So what makes a martial art different from these other things is that a martial arts always, for it to be a martial art, there must be some type of combative encounter. And what is a combative encounter? It's facing an opponent, especially when you're scared to face an opponent. And to progress in a martial art, your opponent should be a resisting opponent. It can't be somebody that's weaker than you. There's no courage in that. So in Korean, we have different words for fighting. Now, the word that is used these days is gyorugi. And gyorugi is competition sparring. And it's such a pity that that has become the prominent word. In the previous word that they were using was deryon. Now, that ryon character means forging. So it's the act of forging, of becoming stronger, harder, physically and mentally, is deryon. The word we use in ITF Taekwondo is matsogi. Matsogi literally means to face.
Sounds a bit Japanese, matsogi.
Well, sogi is stance, standing.
Okay.
So matsogi is to face the opponent or to face conflict. So whenever you're doing sparring in ITF Taekwondo, you are willingly walking up to an opponent, to what you fear, and you have to face it, face your fears. So building courage in that sense.
Who's the scariest person? It might not be the scariest person that you've faced, but when in your journey was that courage, that facing the opponent, the most real?
Oh, this will venture into a completely different thing. It wasn't a opponent, it was a series of tragedies. So when I was at university, my mom was already quite sickly, and my father was shot during an armed robbery in South Africa. Now we would call it a farm murder. At that time, we didn't have the vocabulary for that yet, but that's basically what it was. So my father was shot, and my mother, who was already quite sick, died within months of that incident, most likely because of shock. But yeah, it's difficult to say. In any case, so my father got shot, my mother dies, and several months later, my girlfriend died in a car accident. And that same year, my best friend met his future wife. So suddenly his attention was away from, I mean, it was focused on the love of his life, which is a good thing. But for me, it was another loss. So I had a series of losses. Some of my other best friends were also in this car accident. And anyway, so this series of losses, and there was some more. And I really think that Taekwondo was not but it was one of the things that helped me to get through this. For several reasons. One of them was it had built in me a type of fortitude, which I know I didn't have before I started Taekwondo. So by the time these things happened, I've already been doing Taekwondo for 5 or 6 years, and it really created in me a indomitable spirit, which I'm sure I didn't have. And it also created the space for me to maybe grieve. The dojang is a space where I can go and exercise my inner anger and depression and whatever. So I went through quite a depressive period at that time. Like didn't want to get out of bed, just stayed at home, didn't meet people, but I wouldn't miss Taekwondo training because it was this disciplined thing that I would do. And I was an instructor too, so I kind of felt like I had to go for the sake of my students. So 2 or 3 times a week, I would go and I would train and I would actually interact with people and not be so isolated. And it's maybe not the type of answer you expected. It's not like facing a killer or something, having to defend myself on the streets. But it was, for me, that was like the dark night of the soul. And Taekwondo was one of the things, not the only, but one of the things that helped me to get through that time.
I think it's a beautiful advertisement, not just for Taekwondo, but for discipline and practice and purpose. And sometimes they're not just hobbies. They're something deeper than hobbies. You perfect a craft. I might take this into it. It was a wonderful story, though. Thank you for sharing that. Sad story. The idea when Western people first encountered martial arts from the East. I've read lots of stuff about sort of missionary encounters and when sort of they first encounter Confucianism and they first encounter sort of the top knots and all of this. But I wonder what happened when people that are so versed in a Western combat style and then they start seeing the Shaolin monks or whatever it was originally, how they would have reacted or what those early interactions must have been. Do you have any sense of what that would have been like? Because now it's like we know all the football players, we know all the teams, and we know all the sports and the Brazilians and this and the Israeli one you mentioned, and the world's not as mysterious anymore, I don't think. Those early interactions must have been very weird.
Yeah, so I wasn't there. I wasn't born yet. So I can only guess. But we have some intimations of it. We have people writing about it. People were in awe. Like they had never seen something like this. Western boxing and Greco-Roman wrestling were the 2 main fighting systems. And these fighting systems worked in very different domains. Like somebody would be a boxer and somebody else would be a wrestler. But I wouldn't necessarily do both and combine them, and there was no platform to practice both at the same time. So maybe there were some street fights, underground fights at that time. But what the Asian martial arts did, East Asian martial arts, it was kind of combine all of this with a mysticism, with a philosophy, which is quite different. Western combat sports have lost its philosophy. Now, long ago, in the 16th century and earlier, we had chivalry. So the knights learned how to fight, and they had a chivalrous code that they lived by. So these things were quite connected. But in the modern world, that has completely disappeared. We still have remnants of these old fighting systems. For instance, spear throwing, an Olympic sport. That was the javelin, throwing the
Okay.
javelin. It was a important military activity. And it used to be part of jousting and part of the whole tradition of, even as far back as the Greek Olympics, there was a philosophy connected to it. But most modern combat systems in the West has completely lost all philosophy or cultural, or what shall we call it, cultural heritage from it. It's been completely isolated into the simple physical form within the sports arena. So we don't talk about the philosophy of boxing.
Queensberry rules
Maybe.
is a phrase we
Yeah.
talk about, don't we? We have that that's not cricket. You've got to follow the Queensberries.
Yeah. So and that is kind of sportsmanship. The most we can say about it is, okay, there's some sportsmanship. You are a good sportsman, sportsperson. But otherwise, apart from that, it's completely separated from the culture. So we don't talk about the philosophy of football, the philosophy of golf, or so on. But we often talk about the philosophy of martial arts. Now, the philosophy of martial arts is not something that's necessarily inherent to the martial art itself. It's often philosophies appropriated from the culture, like Buddhism, Taoism, Confucianism, and so on, appropriated into the martial arts. But nevertheless, that's one of the big differences between this Western physical activities and the Asian physical activities, is that with the Asian physical activities, there's a connection between the philosophy or the culture that's often lost with the West. So when these martial arts were introduced to the West, it was quite profound. It was something unique. The same way in which yoga has become such a popular thing in the West, it's because it introduces a physical activity, but it also brings some other component, a cultural, a spiritual, or something else. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a religious thing, because like in the case of Shaolin Kung Fu, it is religious, but most martial arts aren't religious. They don't really teach any spiritual worship or anything like that. There's nothing of that sort, but they do bring a philosophical way, a worldview, a way of understanding reality that's different, an emphasis on the unity of body and mind, which is something that the West have lost, and that's why things like yoga is so popular, because people crave for this mind-body connection. And even more so as we become more and more disconnected, things like martial arts are embodied practices that kind of reconnect us.
It took me a long time to realize the connection between the body and mind, and I think it's been in less than a decade since I realized that if I want a strong mind, I've got to make my body strong. I've got to go out when it's cold and do the running, even though I don't want to do it. And I realized doing that toughened my mind. It took me a long time. I want to ask you about Confucianism, Taoism, and Buddhism, and get you to give us that sort of East Asian worldview. But before I do that, a stupid question. Have you seen Kung Fu Panda, and do you like it?
Yes.
Yes to the first one or the second one? Because this is kind of what we're talking about, isn't it?
I've seen the first and second film. I think there's 3 or 4.
There's probably more, yeah. I've seen the first one.
I've only seen the first and second one.
Yeah.
And yes, I enjoyed it. It's good fun. And the philosophy that they try to bring into it is also nice. It's often the type of things that we talk about in martial arts. Yeah.
He goes to try to get a secret recipe or something, or a scroll, and when he gets it, the scroll is empty.
Yeah.
The answer is inside, and all of
Very
this.
much a Zen Buddhist idea.
Yeah. Tell us about these philosophies, these foundational ideas that seep into the martial arts and influence them in terms of ethics, in terms of movement. So Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, what are they?
Okay, let's start. Well, they are the 3 gems of Chinese philosophy. That's often how they are described. There are 2 or 3 others that are important when we talk about martial arts as well, and maybe we will address at least one of them, Bushido, which is the Japanese code of the warrior, or code of the samurai, which is also very much influenced by Buddhism and Zen Buddhism. But let's start with Taoism. So the Tao is a very, very old idea in East Asia. It is the principle from which all of reality comes. Literally, Tao means path, a road, and within Taoist thought, reality is constituted of the harmony of opposites, or maybe the harmony of natural opposites. Maybe that's a better way to put it. So what do I mean by natural opposites? Well, those are the natural things we can see in creation. That's why that first pattern in ITF Taekwondo, Chonji Ito, really refers to this Tao, this Taoist idea. So what are these natural opposites? Things like heaven and earth, night and day, man and woman, the seasons, hot and cold, hard and soft, those things. So they are not moral. It's not like one is good and the other is bad. So that's why I specifically emphasize natural opposites. And these natural opposites are good when they are in balance and moving according to the natural flow. So it's good for night and day to be roughly 12 hours each. Okay, it becomes a problem when it's the one is too long and the other one is too short or something like that. With the seasons, it's easier to understand. It's good that winter is only a couple of months and not 6 months or 8 months. Or then it becomes unbalanced. So the balance is not only that these things should be in balance, but also that they should flow. There's a dynamism. So the yin-yang symbol has become the foundational symbol for understanding Taoism. In Korean, we call it yang.
We're quite black and white here. Do you
Black and
notice
white
that?
today.
Yeah.
I didn't notice. Yang. So it becomes an issue when they are not in balance or if they become stuck. So something can be in balance, but it's not transitioning naturally. It's kind of stuck in its form. And that, according to Taoism, is bad. So morality in Taoism is not good and evil, like in the Western worldview. It would be stuck in an opposite, in opposition, and then you get conflict. So conflict in society is viewed as one political party having too much power for too long, for instance. That would be a way to see it. And Taoism kind of became the cosmology for East Asia. So all of East Asia for centuries understood reality as this balance of opposites that's constantly in transition. And when it's like that, things go well. When something is wrong, then you get droughts or disasters or political turmoil or conflict in a relationship or unhealth in your body because there's some imbalance in the body and so on.
Can I give you this idea and see what you make of it? That sometimes we think of Eastern philosophies, religions, and foundational ideas like Taoism and Confucianism as spiritual and exotic and full of all of these kind of things and energies, whereas the West is logical and rational. But with Christianity and things, we're talking about other realms and other worlds and heavens and sort of angels and beings beyond. Taoism is very pragmatic, isn't it? This is how I understand it. I'm just trying to get your view on it, that Taoism is everything's right here.
Yeah. So when we talk about Taoism, we have to distinguish between proto-Taoism, which is what we're talking about now. Taoism as this simple cosmological philosophy, and then later classical Taoism, which became religious sects, and contemporary Taoism, which ranges from Taoist temples on the one hand to self-help books or people using Taoism in their business practices.
The Tao of Pu. Last question on this. Is the Tao in Tokyo the same as in Taekwondo? Is that the same Do? Path?
Same word.
Same word, same
Yes.
character?
Yeah. So this Dogyo is Korean for Taoism. This term Do, Tao, are found in other systems of belief in East Asia as well. So Confucianism also talk about Do, and Buddhism as well. Especially Chinese Buddhism, which is Chen Buddhism.
Okay.
Chen basically in Japanese Zen. So when you hear Chen Buddhism, that's Chinese Buddhism. Zen Buddhism, it's the same thing, with some cultural differences. But this type of Taoism, Buddhism, is influenced by Taoism. So the Buddhist temples and the Taoist temples had some cross-pollination, and so East Asian Buddhism is Buddhism with Taoist influences. So quickly going back to Taoism and its connection to martial arts, maybe. So because of this idea of opposites and opposites in motion, it became the foundational way for understanding physical reality, biomechanics, science, and martial art movements. So something like Tai Chi Chuan, which we spoke about earlier, is the practice of yin-yang physically. And Taekwondo as well, Stephen Kapener, who you mentioned earlier, has this wonderful essay about the philosophy of Taekwondo, in which he describes Taekwondo as full and empty space. So empty is and full is yang, so yang. And so let's say an opponent kicks me. The kick represents full space. The empty space is me as the target, or where, like, my opening, because my guard is low or whatever, so I don't have a guard, and he attacks towards that empty space. Now, if I'm a good practitioner, at the same time that he creates his full space, another part of his body will become an empty space, an opening will occur. And if I'm a masterful Taekwondo player, I will notice that and fill that with my kick while dodging his kick. So you have this yang in Taekwondo all the time, this cycle of attack and defense, or filling a space and emptying a space, and so on. So we see that in the martial arts. It's one of the foundational principles. When you start learning a basic martial art, often they will have punching with one hand while pulling the other hand back. So this is yang in practice, but it has a practical value. This pulling back is grabbing the opponent, pulling him towards you while punching. So it's not simply a symbolic representation of yang. In judo, for instance, or hapkido, which focuses on throwing or joint locks, the same principle is used. You use your opponent's forward momentum, the yang, and convert it into what you want to achieve. So constantly being aware of pushing and pulling, or resisting and attacking, these are foundational to understanding East Asian martial arts. If you want to understand East Asian martial arts, you need to understand this Taoist concept of yang.
So it's not two forces, it's not the immovable force versus the irresistible object just clashing with each other, but you have these positives and minuses in almost like a dance and interacting with each other.
Yeah, so in East Asian martial arts, at the highest level is a person that really understands opposite forces, not two opposing forces, but this balance of opposite forces. And to be a great practitioner, a master, is somebody with that ability to exploit or use this interaction. Now, the funny thing is, by doing this, you are in fact creating harmony. So if you and your opponent are really well matched, and there's this really wonderful interaction of him attacking me, dodging and counter-attacking, and there's this flow that happens in that moment. That moment is a moment of Chonji. It's the moment of creation, because you are embodying yang in that moment, and you become part of yang, or what we would say the Tao, or the Do. That is the moment of the Do. You are in complete harmony, and it's something that you can't get on your own. So this is a philosophical idea that derives directly from the martial arts, so which is not necessarily imposed from outside. So it's this idea: to grow in the martial art, you need an opponent, and your opponent becomes your partner to growth, not your enemy.
That's quite nice.
This moment of harmony that exists is that for the martial artists, that is like our enlightenment moment, when things just click and it fits, like the counter attack fits perfectly. That is, for us, it's a enlightenment moment, because that's a moment of yang actually happening in that moment.
Would modern psychology call it flow state or something like that? Because that's how I perceive it.
Yeah.
When you're not thinking, you're just acting naturally without any preconceived thoughts.
Yes.
You're just doing. You're just being.
That becomes, for us, well, it's definitely a flow state. When you spar and you don't think and things just flow naturally and there's a joy or playfulness in it, yes, it's a flow state.
It's like Wu Wei, perhaps, the doing, the not doing.
That is exactly what it is. Now, there's not doing to achieve this. Now, let me think what it is in Korean. Mui.
Yeah.
Mui. To achieve mui, there's not doing, you need to be really skilled.
Yeah. Yeah.
So oftentimes people think, oh, not doing is just not doing anything. But no, it means that you allow the do to occur within you. And I recently gave a presentation. It's an article that still needs to be written on this idea in ITF Taekwondo, which is different from karate. In karate, the technique is epitomized by kime. And this Japanese word kime means decision. Now, kime is the moment at the end of a technique when the whole of the person's body is solidified, and it kind of occurs before that moment. Is you make a decision and you commit totally to that decision. It's the decision of the kamikaze pilot that decides that I'm going to fully commit to this and sacrifice myself. And that's why, like in judo, the highest point, the nippon, is a point in which the opponent, in which you did some type of throwing technique with complete decisiveness or commitment. If you do a throw, but you are not fully committed to the technique, then you won't score the point. The judges would say, oh, it's not nippon, it's not the ultimate point. And the decision should be without wavering. There should be no indecisiveness from start to finish. Now, Taekwondo is different. Maybe this says something about the Korean mindset. The word we focus on is 집중. 집중 means concentration. Now, 집중 is that final moment of concentration when you hit the bullseye, but it is not achieved from a preconceived decision. It is achieved naturally out of the Tao. So it's a reflexive technique. So when we do Taekwondo, that final moment should be tense, but you get there through complete relaxation. So a good Taekwondo technique is a Taekwondo technique that's completely relaxed from start to finish, and just at the final moment there's this 집중, this concentration of mind and body focused on that moment. And this is very much a Taoist idea, is that you should be open yourself to the universe to allow the right thing to come out at the right time. And yeah, I like that idea. It's quite...
I want to ask you what it says about the Korean character. When I think of this Wu Wei and being a master and things look effortless, I think about Ronaldinho playing football and doing the most outrageous things on a football pitch, but doing it with a smile on his face and it looks so easy. Or Jimi Hendrix playing guitar and just creating things, but he's not concentrating. He's just in the moment, and sort of the music comes through him and the football comes through Ronaldinho. And the masters look effortless sometimes, and I think that's one of the key things.
Yeah, so that is Mui.
Yeah.
Effortlessness.
Yeah.
It's maybe a better translation than no action.
Does Taekwondo say something about the Korean character? You mentioned this, and I really like this idea of the softness all the way up till the end, and then that 집중. I kind of see all the Koreans every time they take the photo and they stand there and then they go, fighting. I've just got that image in my head.
I don't know. I haven't read in the Taekwondo literature specifically how that they describe this as part of Korean psyche. But to me, that's a very significant difference between karate, on which Taekwondo is built, and Taekwondo.
The origins of Taekwondo being Japanese.
Oh, yeah, fun story.
I left it for a little while just so we don't get cancelled immediately. But considering what happened with Choi Hong-hi and the foundation of it and the focus on unification, and then that's such a wonderful story and sad story, and then the eventual North Korea aspect. How does the Japan, what's that?
Yeah, I mean, when I came to Korea the first time, I was warned not to be too vocal about this topic.
Okay. Are we allowed to talk about it, or is it?
Now it's okay.
Okay.
Like,
you look hesitant all of a sudden.
No,
I've never seen.
I mean,
I didn't
like
know.
I spoke to people who were investigated by the Korean CIA because of their connection with ITF Taekwondo.
Oh my God.
And long ago, some of these early, we mentioned this first Hallyu, some of those first Korean practitioners, Korean teachers that went to different countries, they were under investigation by the Korean CIA. Some of them were kidnapped during the Park Chung-hee era. Their families were held hostage. So yeah, it used to be very serious, especially because of this connection with Choi Hong-hi, who was basically the enemy of Park Chung-hee. And yeah, but things changed a lot. During the 1930s and 1940s, some Koreans learned karate in Japan. They came back to Korea and started teaching it in Korea, and they would call it Tangsudo or
Not Tangsu-yu.
Gongsudo.
Okay.
Yeah, Tangsudo and Gongsudo. And Tangsudo and Gongsudo are just different hanja that means karate, karate-do. So they taught,
What does karate mean?
Yeah, so the reason there are two terms is because the hanja, the Chinese characters, are different between Tangsudo and Gongsudo, but in Japanese it's still pronounced karate-do. So in both cases, even though the hanja is different, it's just a homonym. So it used to be called Tangsudo. Now, Tang refers to the Tang dynasty of China, and Su means hand. So karate was Chinese hand. That's the original meaning. And in the 1930s, the mid-1930s, with Japanese nationalism, they didn't like this idea of having this martial art that became so popular during that time, called after China. So they found a different hanja, gong, which means open. So karate now is open hand, do. Okay. So that's what the Koreans used. They just used the Korean equivalent of the same Chinese characters, so Tangsudo and Gongsudo. And that's what they started teaching in the 1940s, 1950s, including Choi Hong-hi, who learned karate in Japan. He studied there for a while, and he became involved in anti-Japanese protests. He got imprisoned and was about to be executed, and the war ended a few days before his execution. And he then came back to Korea and became part of the newly formed ROK military, Korean military. There was no military at that time, so they had to basically build it up from scratch with some help from America. And Choi Hong-hi was one of the early people to go to America to learn how to be a leader in the military, and so he progressed quite rapidly in the ranks, and eventually he became a general in the military. And he started to teach a combat system to the soldiers, because they needed to know some hand-to-hand combat as soldiers, but there was no official system at the time in Korea to teach. So he taught what he knew, which was karate. And at one point, Sigmund Rhee, the president, visited this military division under Choi Hong-hi, and he had this demonstration where one of his right-hand man, the strongest soldier he had, broke some tiles, and the president was very impressed, and he says, "Oh, that is Taekyon, our traditional folk martial art." And of course, Choi Hong-hi knows, no, this is karate, but he cannot tell the president, "Oh, we are doing the oppressor's martial art in our military." So this is a big embarrassment for him. And I believe that was the impetus for him to decide, okay, now we have to change. We have to make a Korean martial art. So they built him and soldiers under his command. And so he was a very smart guy at knowing how to get the best out of the resources he had. So in the military, he just found the best athletes, the best fighters, people that knew boxing and karate from different schools and so on. And he recruited all these soldiers to his division, and they started to build this new martial art under his command. And he invented the name. Now, Choi Hong-hi had a kind of a classical education. He studied calligraphy as a child. And he was kind of weakly, so his parents sent him to this calligraphy teacher to get a good education because he will never be a good laborer. He's too weak. And this gave him a great knowledge of Chinese characters. So he started to search for a new name for this new martial art built on karate. And he came up with the name Taekwondo. And this was purposefully chosen because Taekwon sounds like Taekyon. So he could kind of appease the president and say, yeah, it's, what you said, but it's not. So it's not Taekyon. There's very little connection to Taekyon. There's some of these early young people, and maybe Choi himself, had little exposure to Taekyon as children because it was a common game that people would play in villages. But it wasn't a systematized martial art. So we do see some elements, but very little, and some scholars say not at all. There's no connection between Taekyon and Taekwondo. It doesn't matter. This new martial art was formed, Taekwondo. And so let's just look at the characters. Te is a neologism that Choi Hong-hi invented by combining two different characters. Te, the one character is foot, and the other character is elevation. So it's an elevated foot. So a foot in the air, suggesting stomping, kicking, like jumping.
I've seen many pictures of you doing that on your social media.
Yeah.
It's very
Having
elevated foot.
A foot in the air.
Yeah, exactly.
And Guan, we already mentioned Guan. Guan is a term that has a long tradition with the martial arts, and it basically means a fist in action. So boxing, fighting, pilgarism, something like that. And then Do, which became in vogue at that time. Many martial arts of the time started to use this Do suffix. It's like Kendo, Judo, Aikido, Taekwondo, Tangsudo. So it was kind of in vogue to suggest that it's more than just a physical training. It's also a path. It's also a journey of some sorts.
The way of the foot in the air and the what fist?
Yes.
Yeah, and
exactly. So very shortly, people often translate it as the way of foot and hand fighting, something like that. But yeah, it's slightly more complicated, and especially Do can be described. Some people will just see it as a method, the method of hand and foot fighting. So others people interpret it as a psychological journey or a moral journey. Choi Hong-hi himself wanted to emphasize the Do, so the way he wrote it in English was with a dash. So he wrote Taekwon dash Do, and so that's often one of the ways you can distinguish ITF Taekwondo from WT Taekwondo is there a dash or not? Because for him, he wanted to say, well, Taekwondo is this physical aspect, but notice the Do. Of course, in Korean, it's written without the dash, so you can't see that. But that's something he specifically wanted to emphasize, is the moral culture. And his last book that he wrote was a book on moral culture, which was this little book full of old Korean and East Asian idioms and philosophical moral teachings.
Nice. I want to ask you two questions about Choi Hong-hi, actually. One is he well known? Like, if you go to a person on a street, not necessarily a practitioner of Taekwondo, and say Choi Hong-hi, are they going to... Is it like Tabom-gun is a football player, but he's elevated above, and most Koreans might know Tabom-gun of the 1970s, and he's become a figure. How well known is Choi Hong-hi? And I can't picture him. Can you tell me anything? Did you meet him, or what did he look like? These kind of things.
I didn't meet him, sadly. He was quite short. Even by the standards of that time.
Park Chung-hee was quite short as well, wasn't he? You start imagining these two.
These two short historical giants. I think he was really intelligent. Some people would describe him as a genius. I don't know about that, but he was definitely very intelligent. He had a keen grasp of principles. Like he was somebody that thought from principles. But he was also, he had, do you have this expression? I'm not sure if this is an Afrikaans expression. Short guy syndrome.
Yeah.
Sometimes I get my English and Afrikaans idioms confused.
Yes, bro. We would say it about Napoleon.
Napoleon syndrome,
that would just be a sort of propaganda because Napoleon was quite tall.
As a young man, he always felt that he had to prove himself because he was so short, and he would rule or govern with a fist, metaphorically. And in his position as general, he often did that. For instance, I mentioned earlier, he kind of forced the name Taekwondo on the groups of karate practitioners at that time. Do people know who he is? Most South Koreans don't know who Choi Hong-hi is. And they don't know that Taekwondo, the name is only 70 years old. They think that Taekwondo is 2,000 years old, which is a myth invented by Park Chung-hee regime. And this myth is still propagated by some of the big organizations to this day, even though scholarship has now clearly proven that's not the case. Taekwondo comes from karate. It was built on this karate foundation, and then it slowly evolved into a new martial art with very much Korean characteristics. But yeah, most Koreans don't know Choi Hong-hi. Most Taekwondo practitioners, and by that I mean almost every Korean, because nearly every Korean will practice a little bit of Taekwondo in their life. If they don't do it as children, they would go to the military, and they would also do some basic Taekwondo training in the military. They don't know who Choi Hong-hi is. His writings were banned by the Park Chung-hee era. His books were burned. Very few of the original books are left, and those that are left are now in national libraries or in university libraries, so you still can get some of those. But many of his books were written later when he was already in exile. So outside of South Korea, more people know about Choi Hong-hi than in South Korea. Things are slowly changing, but this is only Taekwondo practitioners at the highest level who research the real history of Taekwondo will learn about him. Most people don't know who he is.
So this is real Hallyu. This is the Korean way of going abroad.
Yeah.
This is beautiful. And just as a side note, you said Choi Hong-hi was on the tribunal investigating whether Park Chung-hee was a Japanese collaborator. Professor Carter Eckhart just sadly passed away. And on the front of his book on Park Chung-hee is a photo of Park Chung-hee in the Japanese Imperial Army uniform.
Wow.
That's a bold photo to use on a book like that.
So Choi Hong-hi also, he was, for some period, he was recruited into the military, the Japanese military. But he was also involved in this anti-Japanese protest movement at the same time that he was in the military. So many people at the time were, some people would say they are Japanese loyalists or something. I don't think Choi Hong-hi was. Like, some people say he was, but I don't think so, because so much of what he did was anti-Japanese, or at least forms of decolonization. So when he started to create Taekwondo, it was very much a decolonization project. One of the first things he did was change the name, and then change the kata. So kata is the karate choreographed sets of movements that you have to learn to progress through the belt ranks. So he created new kata, well, pumse or til, that in ITF Taekwondo, naming them after historical figures of Korea. And one of his reasons, he said, was by doing this, he is preserving Korean culture and history. So if ever Korea is again attacked, and the Korean culture is ever destroyed as it was previously, some of Korean history, philosophy, and culture would survive outside by everybody who practices Taekwondo.
Beautiful.
So that was part of his nationalistic, patriotic decolonization movement. So yeah, I don't think he was a Japanese collaborator, even though he has been accused of that as well. So it's not only Park Chung-hee. Many of these early figures were forcibly in the military, in the Japanese military. So
People do what they need to do to survive, and sometimes we judge them through the eyes of the present.
yeah,
I've had one gentleman on here, his name is Dr. Kim Kyung-jin. He survived the Korean, he told the story on the podcast, he survived the Korean War when he was in Seoul by teaching North Korean patriotic songs to people when the North Korean army had Seoul.
Oh.
And that's how he survived, and he can still remember and sing the songs.
wow.
He's a very patriotic South Korean man who loves his country, but
Yeah.
you do what you do to survive, I think. What were some of the things in Choi Hong-hi's book, his books, or his morals, his guidance? You mentioned some of that. Are you aware of maybe what some of his precepts or mottos, mantras would be?
Oh, there are so many.
We've gone from Taekwondo just to talking about Choi Hong-hi. I'm fascinated by this gentleman now. You've got me
Yes.
hook, line and sinker.
So let me focus on two sets of principles that he had. So the Taekwondo tenets, which I mentioned earlier, Yui Yomchi Inne Kuki Pekchol Bulgul, which is courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and indomitable spirit. So even some Kuki Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo schools still use those same maxims.
It's nice that courtesy comes first.
Yes, courtesy is important, but of course we have to remember that this courtesy is a Confucian way. You know, we never spoke about Confucianism or Buddhism. We got distracted.
We'll do that on the next episode.
So courtesy is a Confucian understanding of courtesy, not simply good manners, but it's the appropriate etiquette, the appropriate way of behaving, respecting appropriate titles. Yeah, so courtesy...
Ritualistic almost, isn't it?
Yeah, very much ritualistic. And within Confucianism, ritual is considered one of the ways of becoming a moral person, doing a ritual properly.
This is the soju with two hands, dusonora receiving things,
Exactly.
and the bows.
Those things you learn, like if you learn Taekwondo and you shake somebody's hand, you do it with two hands. You bow all the time. So you learn these kind of Korean social customs as part of a Taekwondo practitioner in Africa, where I'm from, or in Europe or wherever, anywhere around the world. That is kind of part of the training you get. Okay, so the other thing is he made a Taekwondo oath. So this includes things like I shall respect my instructors and seniors, which is good, but it goes all the way to I shall be a champion of freedom and justice, and I shall build a more peaceful world. So those, especially those final two, are kind of the ultimate goal of Taekwondo, is being a champion of freedom and justice. So it can't be just a sport. Because how through sport are you going to be a champion of freedom and justice? And then the other thing is building a more peaceful world. And this building a more peaceful world resonates with another very famous Korean concept, Hongik-indan, which is building a peaceful world through mutual benefit or something like that. So those are probably some of the most important ideas that is taught through Taekwondo. Even Kuki Taekwondo or Olympic Taekwondo and the new textbooks, they include things like Hongik-indan as part of the moral teaching of Taekwondo. Some people complain, saying that it doesn't derive directly from the activity itself. But with most of the East Asian martial arts, it's the morals are not derived from the activity. It is morals that's added to it and taught through the martial art.
How do you feel about young children doing all of this? Because my my kids have done Hapkido, and it's almost like part of the Hagwon circuit. Like you go to piano Hagwon on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, you do Hapkido Wednesday and Thursday, and then you do the Gumon. And it seems like a lot of people do Taekwondo, Hapkido as part of their thing. They're not really breaking tiles, but...
Yeah, well, I am conflicted.
and they get black belts and everything. Like, they're like, my kid comes home and Edward says, I've got a red belt and a blue belt. And I'm like, really?
Yeah, I am conflicted. It's changed because originally, remember, Taekwondo was a combat system designed for the military. That was the original goal. And it's become something completely different. It's become a sport, and in South Korea, it's become one of the after-school care activities. It's watered down into a game, and many times when you go to a dojang, a taekwondo dojang in South Korea, they won't even do taekwondo. They will play dojang football. So they will kick the ball around, soccer, for 15 minutes, and then do a couple of kicks and a few punches, and that's the training. So, whereas if you do taekwondo outside of South Korea, it's often taken much more seriously than in South Korea. I'm quite disappointed with that, and especially with the idea that a black belt can be earned by children. And that's not how it was envisioned earlier. There was something like a junior black belt, but it wasn't considered a true black belt. The student would have to retest when they become an appropriate age to get a proper black belt. And the idea was, if you're a black belt, you should be able to defend yourself, at least against one opponent, let's say without a weapon. But most children with black belts, they can't defend themselves. They will just fall over. So that's really sad. Yeah. And I've gone to... Do you know what a Cookie One is?
No.
So the Cookie One is basically the Taekwondo Mecca.
It's the national
gymnasium of Taekwondo. It's in Gangnam.
Okay.
And I've gone to those promotional tests to see what's happening. And the test is 5 minutes long. So 20 students come up at a time in this battery, and they would perform a bumse, a form, one or two. So if they don't know the form, luckily there's 19 other students around them, so they can just follow them, copy them. There's no way that the judges, the examiners, can see all the students at once and really give a proper judgment. And then they would spar for a couple of seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds, and maybe they would break a very thin piece of board that you can break with your finger if you do it with some effort. So to me, it's really sad. Like, I am saddened by what it has become. Now, having said that, at least they are doing something physically. So much of modern society and young children are sitting, looking down at their mobile phones or tablets or whatever. So at least they're doing something. Yeah. And at least there's a sense of progression. So hopefully, if it's a good school, the gradings won't be farcical. They would actually be tested, and they would learn a skill set, and it creates a sense of setting goals and achieving goals and so on. So that is sad. So in America, there's a term McDojo, so like a McDonald's, but for the dojo or the dojang, and that is what it has become. Taekwondo has become, in many cases, this. There are still great schools in the world, and some great schools in South Korea as well, but they are far and few in between.
Do you feel like a weird responsibility being a foreigner with this very Korean, from Chunji to Dangun Halabodi and all of these figures, and here's you telling the Koreans, no, you're not doing it the Korean way. There's a wonderful irony or something in there, isn't there?
Yeah, definitely. And my students, Korean students that learn Taekwondo from me, they are the ones that always bring up the irony. Like, to me, I'm just here teaching what I think is proper Taekwondo. And then
which you learned in South Africa.
But I started learning it in South Africa. So to me, that's what I do and that's what I love. But they would come to me and say, "Oh, it's so strange. I'm learning Korean culture from you," and especially some of the movements in, especially ITF Taekwondo, and they find it ironic. And yeah, I do feel a responsibility, and it's sad to me that what Taekwondo has become. Yeah, it has lost. In some instances, it has lost its soul.
Can you say something on this then about this ethnographic research and these two words? I heard you talk about entic and emic is because I didn't know what that was, and because when you talk about students coming up to you and talking about the irony of learning Korean Taekwondo from a foreigner, I get that basically every day when I'm teaching Koreans about Korean history and all of these things, and they're looking at me going, "Wow, Professor, this is weird." Similar vibes. Ethnographic research and these two perspectives one can take.
So, etic and emic. Etic, simply it means outsider and insider researcher. So an etic approach is an outsider looking on this culture and making observations and saying, "Oh, that's interesting, what are they doing?" and just writing it up. And so you can imagine like an anthropologist going to an island and observing the Aboriginal people on the island and making notes of their customs, the way of movement and things. And what he sees is an outsider's perspective, and it allows a sense of objectivity to what he is researching or noting. Emic, on the other hand, is insider's perspective. Now, the same researcher now goes to the village, introduces himself, and gets permission to live among the villagers, starts to learn the cultural ways and so on, and all the while also taking notes. And that is a subjective immersion into the culture, and both are important. Because when you're in the culture, it's like a fish in water. You don't notice the water. You need to be outside to see the differences or strange things that are different from, let's say, your own culture. But that doesn't give you the complete picture. You also need to be inside a culture so that you start to understand the thinking or the nuances or the philosophical or cosmological reasoning or whatever, which you can't get as an outsider. So both are necessary when you do ethnographic research, not necessarily by the same person. Some researchers just do kind of ethic research, and ethic research in some ways is easier, and you can get a lot of more kind of objective data. And then some researchers decide to live in the culture, immerse themselves in the culture, and what you then get is a subjective understanding, but it's subjective, so there could be issues and you might not understand everything well. But both are necessary to really understand a culture. So, yeah.
And which one did you do?
So I did...
Well, probably both to a certain degree.
Yeah, so I did both, but from different angles. So I'm emic in the sense that I learned the martial art myself. And then I came to Korea and I started learning other martial arts as well. So I did Taekyon and Hapkido and so on. And I really did it, these other martial arts, because I really wanted to understand Taekwondo better. So I started to notice things in Taekwondo, and then I would ask my instructors, and they couldn't give me a proper answer. And I realized that what I'm looking for is something that they don't know because they don't know the culture. And even the average Korean couldn't tell it to me. It's like a native speaker trying to explain grammar when they're not a linguist. Like, you can't do it. You just know this is what it is, but you can't explain it. Okay, so I took up different martial arts. And all the while, I also started to go to Korean dance performances. And while I went to these performances, I would notice things that we do in Taekwondo or in Taekyon or Hapkido. And there were these movements that I recognize that is different from, let's say, karate, Japanese, the Japanese way of doing it, or from Kung Fu, the Chinese way of doing it. So for a long time, maybe 10 years or so, I would go to these dance performances. And eventually, I started to join classes. I would take dance classes or jangun, like drumming classes and so on. And my reason was I wanted to understand Korean movement better, because I realized that the way Taekwondo has evolved was a cultural phenomenon. It evolved away from the Japanese way of moving to a Korean way of moving, and I wanted to understand what this Korean way of moving is. And so, yeah, in my case, it was both ethic and emic. At first, it wasn't formal research. Like, I just did it out of curiosity. But later on, especially after I did my PhD, it became much more formal in the sense that I started to really do research, look for academic journals on the similar topics, or do interviews with choreographers or martial artists and so on. So it wasn't initially formal. So I would say my study in this field was many, many years, over a decade, but it only became formalized later on. How did they react when I started doing?
Or the dance. Or I also want to ask, I once saw you play a video of a Korean woman sort of bobbing. She was dressed in black and she was doing this. And as soon as I saw that video, I was like, that's so Korean.
Yes.
And I didn't know what it was about it being Korean. But for those perhaps that are just listening, there was a Korean woman dressed in black, sort of like just in a studio. And she was sort of going down and then coming up just in a bobbing motion. But the way she did it is something that I've seen in basically every Korean performance or exhibition that I've been to, and I see something, whether it's dance or sports or martial arts.
Yeah,
I see that.
Yes, and that is part of what we would say Korean body culture. So body culture is the idea that different cultures use their bodies in a particular way. One of the simple things is how you greet somebody, with a handshake or with a bow. That's part of the body culture.
The Korean squat, the Ajumma squat, is that one of them? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
The idea that you can go down or not, yeah.
Well, yeah, because Koreans live on the floor,
Yeah.
it's part of their culture to be able to sit and get up off the floor.
Because they have the heating in the floor.
Yeah,
It makes
it's
sense.
Korean culture. That's part of the body culture of Korea. I mean, things like using chopsticks, that is also part of the East Asian body culture. But the length of the chopsticks is different, whether in Japan
Chinese
and
are really
Korea
long.
and China. Yeah, so things might look similar, but there's differences. So you can look at a Chinese dance performance and say, oh, it looks kind of Korean, but it's not. Yeah, so there's a flavor nuance that makes it different, and this nuance is created by a different combination of shared and unique movement characteristics. So China and Korea have some shared movement characteristics, but also unique ones. And Japan and Korea has some shared movement characteristics, but unique ones. And it's the synergy of the unique ones that create this particular cultural flavor, in this case, the Korean flavor. So this was one of my main research foci. It's still something I'm passionate about. And
Did you just say foci?
Yes.
That's very good. Well,
I still want. I continue this research, and I'm still learning. But I've published an article in a UNESCO book on a chapter about martial arts as traditional cultural heritage.
Amazing.
And this article is basically outlining these movement characteristics that you find in Korean dance, traditional dance, and Korean martial arts, like Taekwondo or Taekyon or Shilim or the other, whatever. And so you mentioned this dancer kind of bobbing up and down, and that is one of the key things about Korean movement, and you can relate it back to Chonji. So in the South Korean flag, you have the taeguk, this symbol of yin yang, but it's unique. It's not the Chinese symbol. It's not black and white with two dots. It is red and blue, and the red symbolizes Chon and the blue Ji, earth. And this tells you that there's a emphasis on what is above, elevated, rising, and what is below and kind of descending. And that's something you see in the movement. Korean traditional movement has what one dance researcher called verticality. She said Korean movement has this emphasis on going up and down. So that's the idea of verticality. And this verticality is achieved through the breath. So by inhaling, the body expands and the knees, the legs straighten, and maybe the limbs would move up. And by exhaling, it shrinks, it contracts. And this is called gulshin, this idea of expansion and contraction. So all Korean movement has this gulshin. Even something like drumming, even the drummer who sits down, if you notice, you would see that their body goes up and down while they are playing the jangun. What is that? Hourglass drum.
Hourglass drum. Sorry.
So it's in all traditional movement you will have gulshin, this expansion and contraction, which is synchronized with the breathing. So this particular focus on the knees is called ogumjil. So ogum is the inside of a hinged joint. Okay. So the back of the knee, the inside of the elbow, the hips. Usually when they talk about ogumjil, they will focus on the knees because that's the most prominent place where you notice this kind of extension and contraction. So Korean dance really focuses on ogumjil. Every movement, every step has ogumjil. Every breath has ogumjil. And taekwondo, when you see taekwondo bouncing on the feet, it's ogumjil. When you see taekyon, which is the traditional Korean martial art, they have a particular stepping called pumbalki. And pumbalki is very much all about ogumjil. It's a triangular stepping, but every step requires you to compress the knee and then expand, kind of spring back. So that's one of the aspects that you mentioned. Ogumjil, you won't see this in Japanese dance or Japanese martial arts. This idea of up and down movement, it's void. It's not there. It's considered wrong because in Japanese aesthetic is based on Shintoism, and Shintoism believes in straight and bright. That's the two main principles. Something should be straight and bright, then it's good. If it's curved or crooked or dark, then it's bad. So the Japanese aesthetic, like think of a Zen garden, it should be clean and open with straight lines and then maybe a little rock island in the middle. Okay. Whereas a Korean garden is kind of natural with lots of Korean pine trees with their curved lines and so on. And that's considered proper. So think of the Japanese traditional dress. The kimono has straight lines. Whereas the hanbok has these curved sleeves and a curved skirt and so on. And this brings us to another extremely important principle in Korean culture, which is gokseonmi. Gokseonmi is the beauty of a curved line. So
that's the mi.
The mi is beauty. The son is line. The hanja gok means melody, basically. So now think of Korean music. It has this treble. So it's a curved note.
It's a warble or something.
So it's not a continuous monotonous note like you would find in Japanese music, this kind of monotonous nasal one note singing. So in Korean music, the gayagum player kind of trebles the string. So gokseonmi is probably the most important characteristic that differentiates Korean traditional movement from, let's say, Japanese movement or most other things. And it's in one part it derives from Korean geography and nature. So Korean mountains are these kind of curvy, sloping mountains in the distance with these beautiful curved lines. And the Korean pine tree is not a straight pine tree like in Japan. It's a pine tree with lots of bends and curves to it. And the Korean sentiment says that is beauty. Okay, so even in modern Korean aesthetic, the S line of a woman is considered beautiful. Now in Korean dance, you see all the movements are movements that they would say they draw circles. Not necessarily a true circle, but kind of elliptical or curved with curvature. So the arm comes up in a very graceful curved way. It doesn't straight up or straight down. There should be a curved movement in the way that it's performed. In karate, if you look at karate movement, it's very much a straight line. So the arm would go straight back and straight forward, or like a punch, maybe from the hip to the target in a very straight line. Now, most people say, oh, that is because the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line. It's for efficacy. But my opinion is no. It is a Japanese cultural aesthetic sentiment or principle, because when you look at Okinawa, where karate is from, the techniques are more curved. But when it was taken to Japan and became Japanese karate, it changed. It became very straight in its way, because it incorporated this Japanese way of moving rather than Okinawan karate. So Taekwondo, if you look at how it developed and how it changed, it started to include curved motions in the way it executes the karate movement. So it's incorporate many of the same karate movements, but the way it's performed is different. It emphasized this curved motion, and through this curved motion they created what the Koreans would call chejikjil, which is whipping motion. So the technique is performed in a whipping like effect of uncoiling movement rather than just a straight shooting. And you get some of that, especially in ITF Taekwondo. It's much more prominent than in Kuki or Olympic style Taekwondo. But even in Olympic style Taekwondo, the way that the Olympic stylist early on changed the turning kick from karate into the Korean dolyochagi, the turning kick in Taekwondo, it's much more of an open kinetic chain, to use biomechanical terms, where the movement starts in the trunk and kind of the momentum is taken from one body part to the next body part, each one adding to the acceleration of the technique to create this very powerful kicks.
When it gets to the end of the jipjung.
Exactly, at the end there's this moment of the whip. So there's these two things, the up and down movements, the verticality, created through gulshin and breathing and the knee motions, as well as the focus on more curved, relaxed motions that accelerates into this whip, is part of both the dance don't do the whipping way, they do it more gently, but in the martial arts it's the same principle, just accelerated. So those are two things. There are several other kinetic principles that I identified, but if I had to isolate three things or two things, it would be these three with the breath.
Professor Jocelyn Clark taught me some very interesting things about Korean music. Because I have some idea of music, but I could never understand gugak or pansori or this music. And I wanted to try to learn it and get into it and be cultured. And she told me it's because, David, you're thinking in 4/4. Korean music is based on 12 with the breath. And it's 3, 6, 9, 12. And the beat is on the 1 and the 9. And it goes up and down. And then she described Han to me, this Korean sentiment. And everybody understands it in different ways. But she said, no, Han is a way of playing. Han is a mode, like you might have a pentatonic or a Phrygian or a major or minor. Han is using lots of long, bendy, curved lines. So you imagine a 1980s rock guitar solo or a David Gilmour or something like this, something that goes, that is Han, and that is the Korean sentiment. And when you need to play a martial, a song for a tangun or a general, it's like tang, 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 lots of hard, sharp lines.
Yes.
And it was so interesting. And then just hearing what you're saying here, that the Korean way is these long, bendy curved lines that reflect these sort of undulating mountains and hills in the distance, covered by the sort of the mist or the fog or the anger that always seems to be wrapped around them like a snake sometimes. That's the Korean way. It's not necessarily always about the extrinsic attire or symbols, but it's more about that inner aesthetic approach to things.
So I did this research on the kind of the movement principles, the kinetic principles that I identified as Koreanness in movement. So my next long-term project, and so I'm not putting a date, it might be years before it's finished, is trying to understand the mental aspect behind the movements. Because that is that's quite difficult. That is a type of emic research that it's really difficult as a non-Korean, as somebody that's raised in a different culture, to really understand that local idea. So yeah, I am looking into that. What can I say about it so far? So you mentioned Han, which the audience probably knows is a Korean sentiment of sadness or melancholy because of oppressive difficulty, something that they can't escape from. So there's no proper English translation.
It's also kind of female and tinged with beauty sometimes as well, isn't it?
Sometimes.
Yeah.
So in the dance performances, you would often see a sigh. So the dancer would lift up and then drop down with this exhalation, and there would be this heaviness to the drop. That's a moment of Han. And if this performance has and more of an emphasis on this dropping and lowering down and very slowly going up but fast down,
There is that physical movement.
Yes,
I see that in the performances.
sigh. Then that embodies more of the Han. The opposite of that is Hung. And so Hung is the upward kind of jumps. So some of the traditional dances will literally jump up. And if there's lots of this upward jumps, then you can say there's Hung. But every movement has both. So it's the Yang idea. It's never one or the other. It's a little bit of both, because Korean dance always goes down and up and down and up. It's just how much the one is emphasized over the other one. That's important.
That's amazing. Because I play guitar, I'm thinking of downstrokes and upstrokes being like the sort of the ska music or the reggae almost, which sounds happy.
Yeah, it's uplifting.
It's Hung. It's that kind of joy,
Exactly.
the joie de vivre or something like that. Yeah, to get into the mindset. David Matsumoto, a professor at, I think it's San Francisco, he said he did something that always stuck with me, and I teach it to my students, but culture being a solution to a problem. So the reason people do things is because it solves a problem, and if it solves a problem, that's why they will do it. So there might be aesthetic considerations involved, there might be sort of psychological things, but people will do what works, and if it works, they will do it, and many people will gather around that. So I'm just wondering that this taekwondo, these movements, this Korean body culture, it must work in some way. There must be some benefits from it. Can you say something about the breath?
Okay, yeah, the breath is important because all Korean movement comes out of the breath. So we can take it all the way back to Taoist thinking. So in Taoist thinking, an important concept is qi, or in Korean it's gi, the breath. And
I thought that was energy.
well, it means both energy. It can mean steam. It can mean wind or breath. So depending on the context, it can have all these different
It's like
meanings.
psyche, I think, meant soul originally or something, didn't it? Or the breath or in psychology.
Yeah, like
the force inside
puma.
us.
What's that word? Puma, which is breath, and or in Judeo-Christian, it's what's that? Ruach, when God breathes into the nostrils of the newly formed Adam. That ruach is the breath of God, which animates Adam. It's the life force.
Okay.
Sometimes it's translated as spirit. So it's the same concept in different cultures. It's the idea. It's the life force that's connected with the breath.
That's why when we stop breathing, we
We are
die.
dead. Yeah. So in Korean traditional movement, every movement comes out of the breath. So it has to do what Koreans call the danjong hohub. So danjong is kind of a chakra point. So it's an energy point in your body, and it's particularly this energy point a little bit below the navel to the center of the torso, or the center of the waist girdle. And this point is considered the center point of the body. That's where the chi is at its most concentrated. And when you breathe in this ki, this energy ball, basically, it grows. This danjon, it's called danjon. It grows and expands three-dimensionally. And when you exhale, it shrinks again. So you can think of it, danjon hohub. Hohub means breathing. Danjon hohub is as abdominal breathing, which you would find in many practices. But abdominal breathing is one-dimensional or two-dimensional. It's just the abdomen going out and coming back in. But the true Danjon breathing is not simply the abdomen, it's the side of the ribs and even the back, if you can imagine it. Everything expanding three-dimensionally from that chakra point, from the Danjon. And from this expansion, the movement comes. So when a Korean traditional dancer lifts her arms or flicks her wrist, that flick happened in the Danjon first. Okay, so the Danjon expands with the in-breath, rises through the torso, through the shoulder, through the arm, and the arm extends. And then to lower the arm, with the exhale, the Danjon shrinks and everything kind of deflates. It's almost like those blown up dolls next to
I don't know how to describe them, but I know what you mean.
Like advertising. In any case, so
tall, long, vertical. They look like sausages, but then they have two arms and eyes on them, and they will flutter very sporadically and weirdly.
And it's because they are blown up.
Continuously in and out, I guess.
And when you switch it off, the thing just collapses. It's a similar idea, is that when you breathe in, you expand the body, and when you breathe out, you kind of contract the body. And it manifests differently depending on the technique you want to do, but usually there would be a rise with the in-breath and then an collapse or contraction with the out-breath. Now this contraction could be the straightening of a punch for punching or a kick, because the contraction is the contraction of muscles, kind of stiffening of muscles, whereas the rising is, while the legs extend, it's not thought of as a stiffening. It's it's an ethereal rising. It's the air in you rising you up to Chon, to heaven. And then with a sigh or a verbal out-breath or a gi-hap in Korean, the energy shout in Taekwondo, that exhalation contracts the muscles into a technique or into a lowering of the body. And you see this in all the techniques, even something like Pansori focuses on Danjon Hohab, this Danjon breathing. To be a good master of any Korean movement discipline, you have to master Danjon Hohab.
Wow.
And depending on the system, there's different ways to do it. In Taekwondo, it's usually just focusing on a short, sharp breath when you want to execute the technique. But in the preparatory movement, it's a kind of a relaxed inhalation, allowing the body to fill with energy, fill with air, and then from there executing the technique sharply.
Amazing. It was described to me that Western music, based on the sort of 4/4 beat that you hear in rock, is like the heartbeat. Da-dum, 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 that most pop music is designed on. And then Pansori, and this music is designed on the breath. So it's that. And that's why I couldn't understand. It's amazing how it goes into all the aesthetics. And the question that I do want to ask you, which you'll probably not know the answer to or be angry with me for asking, is I wonder if many of these techniques are visible in certain K-pop performances. Because we often talk about, Blackpink wore a hanbok on the Jimmy Fallon show, or they danced in front of Gyeongbok Palace, and it's the external symbols being the manifestation of Korean culture in the Hallyu. But I'm just wondering if any...
So... For the most part, no, because K-pop is based on hip-hop, and hip-hop is African-American pop music that uses a 4-beat syncopated rhythm, and Korean traditional music uses a 3-beat, and it's not syncopated in that sense, in the same sense. So it's quite different, and K-pop dance, the basic urban dance, street dance, that's hip-hop dance. It's b-boying, mostly, again, which is based on African-American culture, appropriated from African-American culture. And, I mean, they put a Korean spin on it, but the Korean spin is a modern Korean, a contemporary Korean. It's not traditional. Occasionally, you will hear a song that includes some Korean rhythms or some Korean instruments, but for the most part, no. So, Korean traditional music and K-pop are quite far apart in the musical rhythms, in the scale. I mean, traditional Korean music used the pentatonic scale, which K-pop doesn't. So yeah, it's quite different.
Is there an Afrikaans body culture? Is there an African American body culture? We just spoke when I did the Awesome Korea video, and I know I did it wrong because I sat with my legs crossed. And Korean body culture is don't cross your legs. You're doing very well, sir. But when I did that video, I didn't know they would record my whole body. I thought it would just be, like a headshot that they do on the news. Do you have anything to say about body culture? Because we spoke about Koreans, and Professor Sam Richards once said something like, to understand Korea, you don't just have to know what Korea is, you have to understand what it's not. And so those comparisons can kind of shed light on things. Different body cultures?
So there's definitely, each culture has a different body culture. And in a big country like America, like there's each state maybe has a different body culture. You can imagine people in New York City having a smaller personal space, whereas people in Texas with lots of space has a larger personal space, things like that. One of the interesting things, and this is maybe how I got into body culture, was when I came to Korea the first time, I noticed a strange superpower. And it was that I was able to recognize whether somebody was Korean or not from behind by the way they walk. Okay. And I wouldn't always know from which culture they would be, but I could say, well, that's not a Korean walking there. It's somebody from somewhere else.
It wasn't just the long padding that gave it away.
No, it was the movement. Okay. And occasionally I would notice, oh, but it's a Korean. And then, if sometimes I would ask them if I happened to be brave enough, and they would say, oh, yeah, they lived in America, or they grew up in Canada or something else. Yeah, so their body culture has changed, or they acquired a body culture from where they grew up, even though they're ethnically Korean. Culturally, there's something else. So body culture in all countries. One of the big problems is that it's often difficult for people to know their own body culture because it's like a fish in water. You do it and you don't realize you do it. It's not weird for you until you go somewhere else and you see people doing things differently, and then you start to notice, oh, okay, there's a different way of doing things, there's a different way of moving. So even within one culture, depending on your geographic origins, things might be different. So I haven't done the research, so I can't really say how people in Daegu or Busan moves differently from people in Seoul or whatever. But it's like a language, it's like a dialect. So generally it's the same, but there's some nuanced differences.
It's like an habitus or something that they would talk about. It took me about 10 years to realize that I'd been raised to sit up straight and look people in the eye and shake their hand and, square my shoulders. That was what was expected of me. And it took me about 10 years to realize that's not doing me many favors in South Korea. I'm meant to make myself look small and kind of hunch over a little bit and be curved maybe and look down. And I realized when I started adopting the Korean body culture, and there's a time and a place for different things. Of course, when I am the professor, I'm meant to be bokparo, straight up. But I realized that sometimes it wasn't just about speaking the language, because I could fumble through some sentences, but if I was using the correct body culture, if I was bending down and making myself smaller than the older person that was shorter than me, everything went well.
Yes.
And that's fascinating to me. It took me a long time to realize that, actually, and by learning the Korean one, I was unlearning what I'd previously learned in England.
And sometimes when you go to England, you act in a very strange way to the locals.
I do a fusion style of raising my hand and bowing at the same time.
I found that happened to me. Like I would bow in South Africa, and people would look at me very strangely. For instance, look at your students. Now, many of your students are international students, and then you will have local Korean students. And notice how they present themselves in class. Like the Korean students would often just look down. They wouldn't even look at the professor, which as a foreign professor, it's frustrating. Like, are you even paying attention to me? But for them, it's a sign of respect. And sometimes they would adapt. So I would sometimes walk by classrooms and look at the students when they're in class with a Korean professor. Almost all the students are looking down. And then next door would be a Western professor, and the students have learned to look at the professor, so they know how to adapt to different situations.
Code switching, almost,
yeah,
with their body.
exactly,
Body
yes.
code switching.
Exactly. So I think somebody that's good at communication, it's not just about words, it's about the body language as well. Body culture is a form of language.
Physical empathy. Something
Yeah.
like that. I've never said that before, but there is that, isn't
Yes.
there? There's picking up what other people are doing and matching their vibe.
Yeah,
and
sometimes we
going-
do it like sitting back when somebody else sits back, crossing your arms. Unconsciously, we would mirror what other people do.
It's weird sitting at the back of class sometimes when I'm watching presentations or videos and watching one student will do it, and then it's like a yawn or something becomes
A
contagious.
contagion.
Yeah, but the movements become contagious as
Yeah.
well, and how people sit and reflect and mirror each other. It's probably a sign of empathy or awareness. Or
I have noticed when I go to Korean dance performance now, I would involuntarily move while watching the dance performance, and I'm sure the Koreans next to me think, "Oh, this is so weird. This
yeah,
ginger-bearded foreigner is dancing in his chair." Yeah, it's fascinating. Sometimes it doesn't work. Sometimes it's not beneficial. For instance, I'm horrible at playing golf because I have embodied this verticality in my general movement since I've been doing Korean martial arts for so many years, and trance and so on. Like, so when I swing, I tend to drop my knees, and then, yeah, you see just
too much. Of
lawn fly. Yeah, so it's fascinating how we start to embody the culture we live in. If you stay long enough in a place, your dialect changes, like you start to sound differently, but also your movement changes. And that's very unconscious. It's not something we are aware of until somebody else starts to point it out. Oh, okay, sorry, I said a Korean word while talking to English friends or something, or I bowed, or
I tried calling it Koreanization for a while, and this kind of effect that happens to us, and I think that's what we're describing in various ways. Really enjoyed speaking to you and learning and getting so many ideas, and it's connected so many dots for me. Can we finish? After we do this, I'm going to ask you to do a couple of things for me. But can we finish this one with a couple of recommendations? Books, movies, films. It can be Korean-based, Taekwondo-based, or just anything you want.
Okay, so let's start with some Taekwondo-based things. One is a book called The Killing Art, or maybe A Killing Art, The Untold History of Taekwondo. It's by a Canadian investigative journalist, Alex Gillis, and it tells about this early history of Taekwondo, especially the politics about the early history of Taekwondo, the involvement of the Korean CIA, the feud between Park Chung-hee and Choi Hong-hi, and how Taekwondo has changed, the two streams of Taekwondo, the ITF Taekwondo and the Olympic style Taekwondo, the feud between the two leaders, the hope for reunification, the big egos involved. It reads like a spy novel. Nice. It's a fantastic book for anybody interested in Taekwondo. Then a movie, Best of the Best.
Oh, I remember that.
You saw that movie? Yeah. It's probably the best Taekwondo movie because it shows the sport without it being an Olympic sport. So it's a nicer view of what Taekwondo could be. And it shows many of the values and the struggles and how a martial art like Taekwondo can help you through difficult times. And it's just a beautiful film, and am I ashamed? I'm somewhat ashamed to say that there's always tears involved when I watch that movie.
Yeah.
And then maybe a book. So we spoke a lot about Taoism. So there's a fascinating book called The Jesus Sutras. So this is about the early introduction of Christianity to China by missionaries from Mesopotamia. So it's like 6th century or something.
Oh, wow.
And the Taoists were the first to accept Christianity, because one of the big teachings in Taoism is it's kind of a search for immortality or physical immortality. And when they learned about Jesus who rose from the dead, they immediately were attracted to the teachings, and they also started to call or to recognize some of Christ's teaching in what they understood the Tao to be. So in Christianity you have the idea of logos as the main philosophical principle, and these early Taoists, or these 6th century, 7th century Taoists, made some type of connection between Taoism or the Tao and logos, and the teachings that they inherited started to mix with the local cultures, or it could have been the missionaries that went there, tried to explain the ideas by using the terminology of Taoism and Buddhism and so on. And some of these teachings were preserved and rediscovered, and it's a wonderful read of this interfaith connection between the West and the East, and how they understood Christian principles through a Buddhist and Taoist lens. It's a really interesting read, and it kind of connects to what we spoke about today.
I'm definitely going to find that. That sounds amazing.
Yeah, it's a cool book.
So, thank you very much.
My pleasure. It was nice sharing one of my passions with you.
I felt the
and
passion.
The audience.
Yes. Thank you. Brilliant. Relax.